For Scientific American Science Quickly, I'm Rachel Feltman. On November 16, 1974, humanity sent an unprecedented message into the stars.
If we go as far away as Mars or the other planets and look back, even with a powerful spacecraft, it is essentially impossible to know of human life on Earth. But now, with this radar transmitter, the Earth is exceedingly visible.
That was the voice of Frank Drake, a late astronomer and astrophysicist who was instrumental in sending what's now known as the Arecibo message. Here to tell us more about humankind's first attempts at finding intelligent life in the cosmos and what's changed in the last 50 years is freelance science journalist Nadia Drake. Nadia, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's start with some basic context for our listeners. What was Arecibo and what anniversary are we talking about today?
The Arecibo Observatory was formerly the world's largest radio telescope, and that was until China built their bigger radio telescope more recently. But for many years, it had been the largest telescope on Earth with a dish that spans 1,000 feet. And it had a very powerful radar transmitter that they used to study bodies in the solar system, actually. In 1974, the observatory had just finished doing some upgrades to the facility that were going to turn it into a world-class observatory for astronomy. One of the things they did was they replaced the reflector dish for the telescope and gave it a surface that would let it make observations at frequencies that were really useful for astronomers. And the other thing they did was that they upgraded the transmitter and gave it more power. And to commemorate that upgrade, they decided to have a dedication ceremony and invited about 200, maybe 250 people down to Puerto Rico. And at that ceremony, they sent a message into space using the new, very powerful transmitter.
The message will take a little less than 3 minutes to send. When it is finished, the first words will already be 3/4 of the distance to the orbit of Mars.
And that was on November 16th, 1974. So this is the 50th anniversary of that message transmission.
Very cool. And we're going to get more into the message itself in a minute. But for listeners who don't know, could you tell us about your personal connection to the message?
My dad, Frank, is the person who designed the Arecibo message. And he did that with a little help from some folks who were at Cornell University at the time, which is where he was. So his fingerprints are all over that design and the transmission itself.
Wow. So 50 years ago, we sent this message out into space, and your dad was instrumental in crafting it. What did it contain?
The message contained a lot of information about who we are as humans and where we live, and the telescope, the facility that actually sent it into space. So in a sense, it was basically an interstellar selfie, right? Dad sent an image of humans. He drew a kind of cartoony-looking drawing of a human, and he included information about the chemical elements that make us who we are, some of the biomolecules that make us who we are. He had an image of the DNA double helix, which was still a relatively recent discovery in 1974, and I think was on everybody's minds when they're thinking about, what it means to be human. And then he included a diagram of the solar system that had Earth kind of bumped up, so it would tell anybody who looked at the image which planet we lived on. So it was just a lot of information about humans, where we are, and some of the very basic building blocks that make us human.
Was this the first message that was, sort of seeking extraterrestrials in some sense?
It's a really good question. In a sense, I think you can definitely say that this is the first time that we sent a message to the stars with the idea being that it could be received by an extraterrestrial civilization. It is not the first deliberately designed message to leave Earth. Soviet scientists had actually done that a few years before that, using a planetary radar facility in Ukraine. And they had sent words in Russian to the planet Venus, where we don't think anybody lives. And that message bounced off of Venus and came back to Earth, where it was received by the audience that it was intended for, which was us, humans.
Yeah, more of like a demonstration of power than a serious attempt, maybe.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, is that Arecibo was also a demonstration of the new facility's power. So it's an interesting parallel between those two situations, I think, that, demonstrating the capability of a new facility means sending a message into space somehow.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that what really distinguishes it for a lot of people was how much care was put into creating something that, at least theoretically, could maybe be interpreted by a species that had, completely different language than we did. Could you tell us a little bit about how your dad accomplished that?
I love that you said it was crafted with care. I'm just going to share that observation. Yeah, so Dad had this idea to send a message, and he put a lot of thought into what it would say. And he said ultimately that he wanted to share information that would be useful for whomever detected it, thinking that maybe they could be made of the same things that we are. They might not be. But either way, this would be an interesting scientific result for them. So he didn't want to make the message completely on his own. And he asked for help from some of the staff and the students that he was working with. And he actually did get some help from some of the students. One person who was a graduate student at the time at Cornell University, his name is Richard Isaacman, and he did collaborate with Dad on creating some of the information that's in the message.
And I think, for some listeners, when they hear about messages sent to the stars, it's hard to wrap their heads around, what sort of format this might be in that, makes it at all possible for us to imagine that an alien might be able to decode it. So when we talk about this message being sent, what are we literally talking about? What's in there?
I think when you're considering how do you communicate with someone whose language you don't speak, the answer that Dad reached is using images, using art, something that's representational, that doesn't require a real understanding of vocabulary or, the language that you're using. So he sent an image, and he coded all of the information into that image using a binary code. So it was a string of zeros and ones, literally just 0001010, something like that, where every time there's a 1 in the code, you would imagine shading in a circle. And he sent 1,679, check me on that, bits. And when you arrange those in a grid of the right dimensions, which is the product of two prime numbers, you get this image. And along the top row, it starts with the numbers 1 through 10 in binary, which is kind of what you need to use to decode some of the information that comes farther down.
So you wrote a piece for Scientific American recently where you talked about surfacing some of your dad's actual notes and papers from this time period. Could you tell us a little bit about what you learned from those documents and, of course, from talking to other folks who were involved in sending the message?
Yes, it was really fun. I was going through some of his files, and we found this original or very early draft of the message, which was done on graph paper. It was just penciled in. And you can see that he's working through some of the calculations there about how to do the programming. There are notes in the file that show that he's working out how to represent various elements in the periodic table. And then he's got some calculations that are, it's him calculating how long it's going to take the message to get to the other planets in the solar system, like Mars, Jupiter. Pluto was still considered a planet then, so it's in that list. And what I learned that was probably the most surprising to me is that when I shared an image of that draft on social media, it got a much larger response than I was expecting. It was so many people immediately knew what it was. They were really excited to see it. And it was a kind of fervency and response that I hadn't been anticipating. Because, grown up with the Arecibo message, it's in our house. It's a stained glass window at my mom's house now. And I just hadn't been aware of how much importance it had in collective consciousness of people who were interested in these things.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, I think people are so fascinated in general by the idea of reaching out to extraterrestrial life. So how has that search evolved over the last half a century?
So in 1960, Dad did the first scientific search for extraterrestrial civilizations, and he was looking for radio waves that would be distinctly artificial in origin, because that is what we use here to communicate. So he was really using us on Earth as a basis for what we think we could expect to see from other civilizations as well. And since then, searches for extraterrestrial technologies, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, I would say has evolved in a way that includes many different kinds of signatures of extraterrestrial technologies. So in addition to looking for radio waves, which we're still doing, SETI searches are also looking for optical flashes of laser light or the waste heat generated by energy harvesting megastructures, or really any kinds of weirdness in astronomical data that could be there. I would say the search has broadened quite a bit to include not just technologies that are used in communicating, but just any detectable technology at all.
Yeah. And what do you think the future holds for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence?
I hope it holds a discovery. I really want to find that signal. I think what's also really promising right now is that the search for technosignatures or signatures of technology is really starting to be taken more seriously within the science community. It's not this kind of, people in the SETI community call it the giggle factor that used to impede progress in SETI, but it seems like that quote unquote giggle factor is fading away and SETI is starting to be taken seriously as a science. So that's really exciting. And that's an evolution in thought that I think has occurred over the period of time that I've been a science journalist. So really within the last 10 to 15 years, we've started to see that, which is really exciting.
You mentioned a really fervent response to some of the notes from your dad that you found. What do you think it is about the Arecibo message that is still gripping people 50 years later?
Actually, I'm really curious about what you think. What's your idea there?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I love what you said earlier about the message being almost like a selfie for the planet, just really sort of trying to encapsulate what all we are and sending it out into the galaxy. I think there's something so universal about like wanting to be seen. And I think when we're talking about SETI, again, we do really fundamentally want to not be alone and we want to be seen by whatever else we hope is out there. But then there's also something like a little bit, existentially woozy about it too. I think it feels so big to think about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and having something so tangible and really earnest. I think it's really beautiful. It's a nice thing to do, even if we don't necessarily expect it to get us, a selfie in reply. But of course, it would be cool if it did.
That's a beautiful answer. I love existentially woozy.
Yeah. I think it's because it shouldn't be scary to search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but it's a very big thing. So
it's a very big thing. And, I think there's a little bit of an overlap with some kind of spiritual ideas too, when you think about SETI and the fact that a lot of people think there might be answers out there, some truths, some ideas about, the nature of reality and how we fit into it. And that might fall out of the stars if we find the right beings to communicate with.
Nadia, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I'm sure our listeners will also really enjoy reading your piece on scientificamerican.com. But again, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
That's all for this week's Friday Fascination. We'll be back on Monday with our Science News Roundup. Science Quickly is produced by me, Rachel Feltman, along with Fonda Mwangi, Kelso Harper, Madison Goldberg, and Jeff DelViscio. Today's episode featured original reporting from Nadia Drake. Shayna Posses and Aaron Shattuck fact-check our show. Our theme music was composed by Dominic Smith. Subscribe to Scientific American for more up-to-date and in-depth science news. For Scientific American, this is Rachel Feltman. Have a great weekend.
Ladies and gentlemen, the message is now on its way, and I'll tell you there are a lot of people here who are relieved.